Disobedience through non-payment of taxes, disregard of specific laws or injunctions, publicizing one's cause through marches, rallies, picketing, and other forms of peaceful protest, and finally, constructive programs, low-cost housing, education, health facilities, cooperative banks for the poor. A big part of such nonviolent resistance is tapas, or the willingness to suffer for one's cause. As Thomas Pantham, a Gandhian commentator, puts it, quote, "It is the assumption of satyagraha that when reasoning fails to move the head, the argument of suffering by the satyagrahis helps move the heart of the oppressor or the opponent. Self-suffering, moreover, is the truth-seeking alternative to the truth-denying method of inflicting violence on others." End of quote. Contained in this idea of satyagraha is the question of means and ends, which for Gandhi are two sides of the same coin. Gandhi disagrees strongly with the conventional political idea that the ends justify the means. To the contrary, he held that immoral means taint and distort potentially good ends, and to that extent he placed at least as much, if not more, emphasis on the means, which he described as ends in action. Quote, "The means may be likened to a seed, the end to a tree, and there is just the same inviolable connection between the means and the end as there is between the seed and the tree." End of quote. The forceful and activist character of satyagraha leads naturally to the idea of nonviolence or ahimsa. Gandhi is obviously invoking the Jain precept of ahimsa, or not causing deliberate injury or harm to any being, but Gandhi takes this precept far beyond its merely negative formulation to mean the largest love, the greatest charity. Quote, "If I am a follower of ahimsa, I must love my enemy or a stranger as I would love my wrongdoing father or son." This ahimsa necessarily includes truth and fearlessness. End of quote. Ahimsa, then, is the deployment of moral force to persuade one's opponent or adversary. It differs from violence in that it respects the autonomy and dignity of the other, whereas violence does not. It differs from violence in the perpetual willingness to dialogue and negotiate with the other, and as far as is consistent with rightness, to come to a compromise. Given that one's grasp of the truth is at best partial, it is imperative to see and appreciate the truth in the position of the other and to try and achieve a higher or dialectical reconciliation of conflicting ends. The negotiated compromise has the opposite effect of violence, which involves vanquishing and putting down one's opponent, that inevitably sets up a cycle of resentment, ill will, and further violence. The three concepts I have discussed, satya, truth, satyagraha, truth force, and ahimsa, nonviolence, might give us some idea of the texture of Gandhi's ethical thought. As mentioned earlier, the ideas of truth and nonviolence are certainly to be found in the Jain, Buddhist, and Hindu traditions, but there is a big difference between Gandhi's conceptualization of these ideas and traditional ones. The high standards of moral and spiritual discipline that Gandhi invokes were traditionally part of the spiritual way of life, followed usually just by monks and saints, but decidedly not of people in political life. To the contrary, Indian political thinkers like Manu and Kautilya sanctioned the use of physical force and of violence, both for self-defense and for purposes of political order. Gandhi, by contrast, considerably softens the traditional dualism between religion and politics. He attempts to forge a non-dual relationship between the two, where religion, seen as reverence for and service to life, necessarily leads to politics, the arena for the greatest public service, and where politics in turn is saved from power-mongering and the conflict of factional interests by the moral purification involved in religion at its best. It is very important in this context to distinguish Gandhi's highly moral notions of both religion and politics from the ideological conceptions of them all too common in our time. Certainly, the rise of religious fundamentalism and right-wing religious groups would make any peace-loving person nervous about the marriage of religion and politics. It should be clear, however, from what I have written, that the moral checks and balances that Gandhi exercised over religion and politics purified both domains and offered the world a far different and more noble conception of them that we have yet to measure up to. I'm going to skip a good part because I just want to come very quickly to my conclusion, which shows how some of these somewhat abstract ethical ideas were actually put to work in a march that, as you'll see, had profound effects not only in India but then throughout the world. And this is the famous march. How many of you, by the way, have seen Richard Attenborough's famous film, 1984, Gandhi? I would strongly urge that you see it because, I mean, you'll see the march and it has a visual and visceral impact, which those of you who've seen the film might then be able to identify. So here's just a short section on that famous Salt March. Having provided some foundational moral ideas underlying Gandhi's theory of satyagraha, I will now furnish an example of an occasion when these principles were applied to momentous effect, namely the Salt March of 1930. If Gandhi's life and work have been described as representing, quote, the greatest application of the principle of peace on a political level that the world has ever seen, end of quote, the Salt March in turn represents one of the signal moments of that life. On the one hand, it crystallized and brought to a head many years of personal struggle and discipline in what Gandhi himself described as the final test of his resolve and perseverance. On the other hand, it galvanized the Indian national movement and the masses at large to call and struggle for complete independence from British rule. Furthermore, thanks to Gandhi's skillful use of the media, he was able to attract the attention of world opinion and put considerable pressure on the British government. Gandhi was quite unabashed about this appeal to the international public. Quote, I want world sympathy in this battle of right against might. I'm again going to skip some and come perhaps to the key moments. As I analyze this particular satyagraha or march conducted in truth, I shall proceed first by describing the facts, then scrutinizing some of these key features, and finally end by describing its effects. First, the facts. In the early months of 1930, in response to the growing protests by the Indian people against British imperial domination and oppression, the Viceroy at the time, Lord Irwin, proposed a roundtable conference with some of the leaders of the Indian National Congress. Gandhi, who had earlier been given permission by the Congress to launch a by the Indian Congress to launch a civil disobedience campaign in early 1930, wrote to the British Viceroy with an 11-point demand seeking redress of various injustices affecting different sections of the Indian population. One such demand was for the abolition of the salt tax and the state's salt monopoly, which had long been seen as a source of oppression, especially against the poor, and as an affront to national dignity. If no such redress was forthcoming from the government, Gandhi announced his intention to disobey the provisions of the salt laws. Lord Irwin, the Viceroy, replied that he regretted Gandhi's decision to violate the law and disturb the public peace, but provided no indication of any consideration of the demands specified in Gandhi's letter. Thus was launched Gandhi's most famous and difficult struggle against the world's largest, wealthiest, and most powerful empire. On the morning of March 12, 1930, Gandhi set out with 78 of his followers from Sabarmati Ashram near Ahmedabad on a 24-day march covering some 245 miles to the ocean by Dundee, a village south of Surat in Gujarat. There, on the morning of April 6th, after morning prayers, Gandhi went to the beach with some of his followers and waded into the sea, declaring, quote, "This religious war of civil disobedience should be started only after purifying ourselves by bathing in the salt water," end of quote. He then picked up some natural salt, thereby breaking the salt law. With this, Gandhi said, "I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire." With that simple, defiant act, Gandhi had indeed initiated a chain of events which 17 years later would result in the independence of India from British rule on August 15, 1947. Three features of the march are particularly noteworthy. First, Gandhi chose salt as a single focus issue because it affected all Indians, but particularly the poor. This tactic also highlighted the oppressiveness of the British Raj in claiming a monopoly of salt production and in taxing an item of widespread use. As the revenues such a tax generated were somewhat marginal to the imperial coffers, Gandhi shrewdly calculated that there were unlikely to be very severe reprisals on the part of the government. Second, the entire march was very carefully planned and organized as to local arrangements and logistics. Crowds greeted the marchers at every step, and Gandhi frequently gave speeches and encouraged the onlookers to join them, which they frequently did. The world press, meanwhile, reported his every move. Gandhi, thus urged on by his fellow men and women, not only walked 10 to 15 miles each day, but continued to write numerous letters to correspondents and articles for the press during his stops. With the attention of India and the world riveted on Gandhi, the British government was fearful of arresting him in case they provoked large-scale revolt. Gandhi took full advantage of this fear by openly urging Indians to manufacture, use, and trade in salt at every opportunity. The arrest of Gandhi finally took place almost a month later on May 5th, when he and his followers raided a salt factory near Dundee in response to the British government's attempts to circumvent this tactic by combing the beaches and removing as much salt as they could from sites where salt could be found. By that time, the entire nation had been roused to massive civil disobedience. As a British official in the government of Bombay saw it, more and more people were joining Gandhi in his movement, quote, "not because they expect any definite results from anti-salt laws campaign, but because belief that British rule is morally indefensible and economically intolerable is gaining strength among educated Hindus." End of quote. The third, but no less important feature of the march was the strict moral and spiritual discipline that each of the 78 carefully chosen members was expected to maintain. All were required daily to pray, spin, and keep a journal, which Gandhi could ask to read. So strict was the discipline that when Gandhi saw some of the marchers being inconsiderate towards a servant, he berated them, quote, "Remember that in Swaraj, we would expect one drawn from the so-called lower classes to preside over India's destiny," end of quote. The Salt Satyagraha certainly counts as one of the great triumphs of Gandhian nonviolent resistance. It convinced Indians that British rule was vulnerable and that they could put an end to it if they summoned the requisite will and resolve and generated what would later be